Welcome to this National Safe Work Month event, and in many respects this is our last event for the month, so welcome. I hope you enjoy it and get something from it. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on here today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. As I said, it's great to have you here for National Safe Work Month. This year we've had a huge presence on social media, something I'm not too familiar with, so I'm going to be getting on there and hashtagging on various platforms, so we encourage you guys to get onto Facebook, Twitter, whatever platform you use, and use the hashtag @SafeWorkMonth. Before we get the speakers started, I'll just run through a couple of housekeeping matters. In terms of an emergency, the fire exit is behind you guys. If something does go wrong, please calmly exit through the back doors and through to your left, out the way you came. If there is a need to evacuate the building, wardens will direct you to the assembly area via the fire exit door. If you guys are looking for a bathroom during the session, we will be having a break just after halfway through, but if you are looking for a break, the toilets are located directly across the hall from the back doors. Smoking, of course, is not allowed in this building, and can I just ask that you switch your mobile phones to silent. This session today includes presentations by 3 speakers, and it'll be followed by a panel discussion. Each speaker will speak for around about 45 minutes. After the first 2 speakers, we'll take a short break. Our first speaker I'd like to introduce is Paul Dickinson, someone I know reasonably well because I sit next to him at work. And I've seen him working feverishly on this presentation, so I know it's going to be of high quality. Paul's worked as a forester and an industrial engineer in New Zealand for 20 years. He became a certified ergonomist in 2004 and moved into safety and production research work. He moved from New Zealand to Adelaide in 2008 to work as a work health and safety advisor in manufacturing. Last year, Paul joined our team, and it's been great having him with us. Certainly someone who has great depth of knowledge, a great researcher, and I'm sure will deliver a fantastic presentation for you. So please join me in welcoming Paul.
Okay, thanks, Shane. I've just got to admit something to start with. I can't actually see you guys at all when I'm standing from here onwards, but I bet you can't see me when I'm out here, is that right? Yeah. Okay, so I will stand in the middle, but please just bear in mind I can't see you, so what I might do is, can I encourage you to try and hold off on questions until the Q&A session at the end, and I promise you we will have a good 15-minute or so Q&A session. Okay. So as Shane said, this is a joint presentation, and I'd like to welcome our 2 other guest presenters here, Heidi from Hintle Consulting and Saudi from Return to Work SA. And this is our agenda for today. And actually, I'll give you just a bit of background first. Shane gave me a bit of an intro, but I have to admit, in my younger days, I was a bit of a badass, I guess. I left school when I was, must have been 16 years old in 1982, and I actually went, this is in New Zealand, I went commercial hunting for a couple of years, so hunting deer, hunting possums, and I went from there to actually working in the bush as a labourer for about 5 years. So I never actually went to university until I was about 25 years old. So just did real hard yards, dirty work for a good 5 to 7 years. And when I look back on it now, I learned so much doing that hard physical type work, especially when I try and relate it now to the ergonomic stuff, which I've been doing for the last 15 to 20 years. Because it's given me that background as to knowing what workers feel, like I've felt all, you name it, I felt it. In terms of the hard work, and seeing what my workmates have put up with as well. So I'll give you that background, because for the second half of my talk today, I'm going to focus on 2 things I've I've discovered over the last 30 years of work that I believe aren't well documented or aren't well discussed in terms of control of hazardous manual tasks. And it's things I have picked up, they're very valuable, and I want to share that with you. So my main objective is for you guys to go away after my talk, taking at least a couple of things home with you and back to work with you that you really learn from and apply in your workplace. And the first thing, before I even start talking about hazardous manual tasks, I want you guys to think of this topic as an opportunity, and think of HMTs, as hazardous manual tasks, think of those, the control of those as an opportunity, not a cost. As you can see here, you can generate improved productivity, quality, motivational benefits, but also I'm aware of a number of what I call our competitor countries around the world, especially manufacturing countries, who I know are doing extremely detailed work in this area, not simply for safety, but for enhancing productivity in the work processes. So you need to look at it in terms of an opportunity and actually keeping us on a par with our competitors, if not getting ahead of the competitors. And obviously, point two there, if you happen to be in an industry that's actually designing, manufacturing, or supplying equipment, for example, obviously if you can prove that you're building controls of hazardous manual tasks into your products, it can give you quite a significant marketing advantage. Also, if you're in a service organisation, if you can prove to the customers of yours that you're building control of HMTs into your work processes, be it through your SWIMs, as your safe work method statements, or JSAs, if you can prove that, I believe you're far more likely to be given work and be given a better price for that work as well. So I have to give you a few definitions here. So an HMT, that's the definition straight out of the Code of Practice for hazardous manual tasks. And I think from this point on, I'll just use the term HMT, just a bit easier to say, hazardous manual tasks. So basically it's a task that requires a person to lift, lower, push, pull, carry, or otherwise move, hold or restrain any person, animal or thing that involves one or more of the items on this list. And I've added something here on the right hand side. It does not have to involve any external force. Now there's a bit of a misconception out there that a lot of people think of hazardous manual tasks as heavy, unwieldy type movement of objects or people or things. But I'll show you on the next slide here. That's actually a hazardous manual task, what the guy's doing on the top line there. There's no external load involved. He's simply bending over measuring a log. It's simply the weight of that guy's own upper body weight leveraging on his lower back is causing him to actually commit an HMT. Another example, I hope you can all see me here, just somebody typing on a computer workstation like this, hovering over the keyboard, so not actually touching the keys, just hovering over the keyboard. That's actually an HMT, because you've got the leverage force of the weight of your arms and hands leveraging on your shoulder. Okay, so there's no external force involved, but it's still an HMT. And you'd find if you were doing that for a good 5 to 10 minutes without movement, you start to feel some discomfort and pain due to lactate buildups. So just keep that in mind. We're not only talking about the very heavy stuff, it's very light stuff without any external loads also comes under this definition. Now there's one other definition I have to tell you about, and this definition again is taken straight out of the Code of Practice for HMTs. A musculoskeletal disorder, or MSD, which is a injury to or disease of the musculoskeletal system, including these examples here. Now I think we're all familiar with the first ones, sprains and strains. The key word on point 2 that I want you to keep in mind is the word degeneration. And something I'm going to talk about later in my talk is the fact that a lot of degeneration type injuries now are occurring not as a result of too much movement, but actually lack of movement. So it's sedentary work. And again, that's something people aren't very aware of at the moment. It's becoming a huge issue in our modern society. And a good example is our spine. If you think of the intervertebral discs between the vertebra and our spine, one of the design faults in our bodies, if you can call it that, is the fact we have no blood vessels going into the discs in our spine. So the only way you can feed those discs to get the oxygen in, get the waste products out, is through movement. Okay, so you've got to be moving as much as possible, and it's actually lack of movement now that's causing that, causing quite a large proportion of those degeneration injuries. Nerve injuries, if you've heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, for example, that's an example of a nerve injury where ligaments are putting pressure on the median nerve in the wrist. Vascular refers to your blood vessels. So for example, if you're using a vibrating hand tool and you basically kill the capillaries in your fingers with vibration, that's an example of that. And hernias as well. So these are all examples of MSDs. Now, you might ask, why are MSDs important? We've got some good data from Safe Work Australia, some injury data, which has shown that about 2/3 of all MSDs in Australia are caused through hazardous manual tasks. And there's a huge cost involved. Okay, so MSDs make up 40% of all serious injury claims in this country. And you can see the cost there, $24 billion annually to service these claims. So if you think what our population is here, it equates to something like $1,000 for every man, woman and child per annum in Australia, going towards covering the cost of these types of injuries. So it's absolutely huge, but it gets worse. If you look at the pyramid on the right, for every one of these serious claims, and when I say serious, the criteria is more than 1 week off work. So for every one of those, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of other cases of discomfort, pain and injury from MSDs that we're all experiencing in our society. So you can see it's an absolutely huge issue. And one question I'd like to put to you guys is, if you see that 40% of all serious injuries in the country are MSDs, how many of you guys in your workplace would be putting 40% of your safety spend into control of MSDs? So I'll tell you what, in all the places I've worked in the last 30 years, I'd say you'd be lucky if 5% of any company's total safety spend goes into MSDs. And a couple of reasons for that. The first reason, I believe, is people are ignorant of some of these stats. So hopefully what I'm showing you today will maybe encourage you to increase the proportion of time you devote in safety to this topic. But also, could be fortunately or unfortunately how you look at it, with MSDs there's no blood, guts or fatalities involved. So, and it takes people tend to divert their safety spend to those more nasty types of ailments, even though we've got this huge cost here. Now, one of the reasons for this session was to tell you about the Code of Practice for HNTs. You can download this code off our Safe Work SA website, and we've got some pretty good pamphlets out the front where you came in today. Please grab some of those when you leave, which gives some basic guidelines about the content of the code, that you can go onto the website and download the whole thing. It's about 55 pages, but the good news is that about 2/3 of those pages are made up of easy to read photographs and diagrams, which gives you really good ideas to follow in terms of the identification and evaluating controls for particular HNTs. But what I find very good about the Code of Practice is it gives you the whole shooting box of not just the ID and the analysis, or assessment of those hazards, but it takes you right through to allocating people to be accountable for solving those issues and implementing control actions. So implementation with timelines. And I've found, again, through my work experience, that's the thing that falls down the most. There's some very good hazard ID, very good assessments, but then you turn up at the safety committee meetings month after month and the same items are still on the agenda, simply not being solved. So the code actually gives you a tool to follow through. So that's what I call the whole shooting box. And if you're not familiar with the concept of codes of practice, the next level down after the regulations, so you've got the WHS, or Work Health and Safety Act, and the regulations. Now, anything in those two documents is mandatory legally. Below that's the code of practice, which are almost mandatory, it's the best way to put it. You have to comply with the content of the code of practice unless you can prove that you have other control measures in place for the hazards concerned, which give an equal or better result to what's in the code. And we know that some of our inspectors and safe workers say they can use the content of this code of practice when they write out improvement notices or prohibition notices. Okay, so it is quite a hefty document, and I'd highly encourage you to get a copy of this, read through it, and look for the bits relevant to what your organisations are doing. Now this is where I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent. I've given you some definitions. Now these are the risk factors named in the Code of Practice for hazardous manual tasks. And I'm just going to focus on two of these based on my work experience to really give you something practical to take home and think about. And the two I'm going to talk about is high or sudden force, otherwise known as acceleration or deceleration. And the other one's sustained posture, or sometimes known as static work, where the muscles are working but not moving. Okay, so I really want to tell you about acceleration. Now, some of you guys will be very familiar with this, some won't. So I'm going to do a couple of exercises to show you what I mean here. Probably the best way to explain it, what I've got here is just a packet of a photocopy paper, one ream of paper. The reason I've chosen this is it's something we handle every day, most of us, so you're familiar with it. This weighs about 2.5 kilo. And we've just got a simple force gauge here. Okay, so I pick up the piece of paper here, it's showing about 2.6 kilo. Now, I'll set it to peak load. Now you watch here, I'm going to lift this up very slowly. And that's how you should be picking up loads, very slow acceleration. And again, the load's hardly raised at all with slow acceleration. So effectively, you've still got about 2.6 kilo. But what happens one day, I come along to pick up this load, I'm in a hurry, or it could be I'm on a piece rate bonus incentive system. I could be working in a warehouse getting paid by the number of boxes moved per hour. So I'll come on in a big hurry, do that, which a lot of people do. I'll do it a few times to get an average, but that one there wasn't too fast, but it went up from about 2.5 kilo up to 6.65 kilo. So what we've done is trebled the effective force with quick acceleration. So here's another one, 7.86, so almost quadrupled. And honestly, I used to see this every day, especially in warehouses, people coming and snatching at loads, and it was highly correlated with the payment system they were working under. And it actually gets worse when you talk about stopping a load that's falling, so deceleration. It's actually twice as bad with deceleration due to the force of gravity. And the best way to show you that, I'll just zero this again. So we've got our 2.5 kilos here. What I'll do is I'll drop it from this height down to here, which is about 3/4 of a metre. Okay, that was slightly over 10 kilo. Okay, so for 3/4 of a metre drop, you're getting close on 10 kilo. So again, at least a 4-to-1 ratio. And something I've seen a lot of, especially in manufacturing industries, is maintenance fitters maybe taking a guard off a machine, for example. So they're unbolting a guard, they don't realise the last bolt's come off, the guard starts to fall. By the time they catch it, it's already fallen about 1/2 metre, from 1/2 to 3/4 of a metre. Some of these guards weigh, a good 25 to 30 kilo. Suddenly, when the guy's trying to catch it, firstly they're in a bad posture. By the time they catch it, they're bending, twisting, which is very bad, and the load's gone up to probably a factor of 4 or 5. So that they're actually trying to catch something over 100 kilos in a bad posture, and they don't even think about it. It's just a natural reaction to catch that load. Now, if you went into the code of practice for HMTs, or looked at so many other ergonomics documents, you'll find very little written about acceleration. But what I'm trying to show you here is simply how important it is. And that's exactly why there's actually no legal load lifting limits specified in Australia, because you can't say things like no one's allowed to lift a bag weighing more than 15 kilo, for example, because 15 can become 45 or 60, depending on the acceleration, as well as depending on the leverage force from how far you hold it out. Okay, so you all understand that concept of acceleration, and that's something I really want you guys to take back to your workplaces with you. When you do your task analysis in your workplaces, look at how fast people are picking things up, try and slow them down. And this is why I've shown you this photograph here of the guy planting trees. He's actually planting little pine trees. So there'd be probably 150 seedlings in the box there. This guy plants about 1,500 trees per day, and every time he plants a tree, he gets in this sort of posture, so quite a bad stoop. He's got an upper body weight of somewhere around 50 kilo above the waist, so he's got 50 kilos of weight leveraging on his lower back at about a 5-to-1 leverage ratio. So he's actually putting somewhere around 250 kilos compression force on the spine. Now that's actually quite safe. A healthy adult male can handle about 350 kilos of pressure on the spine. But that's assuming no acceleration. Now unfortunately, these guys were all paid on a bonus system. They were all going like hell to make money. And this guy was accelerating with his upper body after he plants each tree with a force ratio of about 3-to-1, like I showed you on the gauge there, snatching of the load. So the same thing's happening with the load of his upper body weight, leveraging too fast, and suddenly he's facing about 750 kilos of pressure on the spine, which is more than double the safe limit. And it's all to do with the accelerated force. So what we had to do was train these guys for just that split second when they first stand up, to take it very slow. Then once they start moving, then they can speed up. Exactly like a weightlifter. If you watched weightlifting on the Olympics, the guys hold the bar, they feel the load, and for that first split second, they move very slowly, and it's only when the load starts to move that they smash, and it's okay then because it's already moving. So that's a real life work example of when people weren't doing it right, putting themselves at great risk. And we just had to slow them down just for that split second when they first start getting upright. And I think it added about 10 minutes to an 8-hour day, but it really saved the backs. actually going to talk to you about posture today. I just want to focus on the other things, but just want to mention the leverage force on the guy's back. That sort of explains that your limbs are actually classed as levers. The further anything goes out from your body, there's more leverage force in your body. Now the second and probably more important thing I want to talk to you about is the hazards of, actually I'll call it the combination of repetitive movement and sustained loads. Now that probably sounds like an oxymoron. How can something be repetitive and sustained? Any ideas from you guys? Can you think of a task at work that's both repetitive and sustained? Okay, both these pictures here show people doing very fast work with their hands, fingers and wrists, but the rest of the body is not moving. And this creates major issues, and it is becoming a real major modern problem in society. The fingers are moving very fast. They need fuel. The only way they can get fuel is blood circulation down through the shoulders, down the arms to where it's needed. Because the shoulders aren't moving, they're not getting that fuel. Now, we probably don't have time today to all do this exercise, but what I'd encourage you to do back at work, and please do this carefully, but grab yourselves a ream of photocopy paper, get your team together, get each team member simply to do this for a couple of minutes. Keep their arms horizontal to see how long you can last. And I guarantee within 2 to 2.5 minutes, most of your team are in a lot of pain. So you'll feel very bad burning sensations in your arms. And what's happening is simply your muscles are working without oxygen. And it's a simple demonstration to show you, even with a weight quite light like this, within a couple of minutes you'll be burning. Because when your muscles are in tension like that without oxygen, it's called static loading, and the pain you're feeling is mainly lactate or lactic acid building up in your muscles. And the point I want to make here is you can actually get exactly the same problem in these tasks. It takes a bit longer because there's less weight, but the weight simply from your own arms and hands, leveraging on your shoulder. For most people, they're incurring between 10 and 15% of the maximum shoulder muscle force, just doing this with no external load. Anything beyond about 10% of your maximum shoulder force, you must take rest breaks, otherwise you're not going to get sufficient oxygen. And as we all know, no matter how many times we tell people to take micro pauses, at the computer workstations, for example, or the machine operators, they don't take them. They always come up with excuses that it's somehow affecting their production, and it's not. We've actually proven in many cases that you take micro pauses every 5 minutes, you can actually increase keystrokes by 20%, increase quality, reduce mistakes, all that sort of thing. Now, the guy here in the second cartoon, I spent about 6 weeks when I was back in New Zealand going around logging operations, talking to digger operators about all the aches and pains they were getting in their shoulders, and some of these guys in particular getting a lot of pain between the little finger here and the elbow. Because on that left-hand joystick they had a cut-off saw button. They had to hold this button in for sustained about 15 seconds, about 3 times a minute. The fingers and the wrists all moving pretty fast, but the shoulders weren't moving at all. And we actually found simply by teaching these guys about micro-pausing, all the pain went away. It was that simple. And all we're talking about was about every 5 minutes they get their hands off the stick, off the joysticks, and simply do this. Just for about 5 seconds maximum per 5 minutes. So what I'm talking about here is, think about any situations in your workplace anything from computer workstations to maybe assembly operations, if they're in a factory assembling maybe electronic products. Exactly the same thing's happening. People's hands and fingers are moving very fast, but the shoulders aren't moving. In fact, the reason this is so bad now, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, is our manufacturing industries continue to endorse something called motion economy principles. Now, motion economy has been a swear word in ergonomics now for probably 20 years, because motion economy, what it does is encourage what's known as static work at the expense of healthy dynamic work. And I'll explain to you what this means because it's very important. Dynamic muscular work, this is something that we've evolved to do over arguably millions of years. Our bodies have evolved to do dynamic work. And I've shown you a photograph here of a guy pruning pine trees. And he's got a pair of secateurs and he's basically doing this. Now this is actually a fantastic example of a task which shows that even with high repetition and high forces, if it's healthy dynamic work, those guys can work days, months, years doing this task without being injured. And I've still got a few friends from working in the bush who do this task. They're in their early 50s now. They're still healthy as the day they started work, yet they're doing all this heavy work because it's dynamic. So getting the good blood flow. Conversely, you've got the opposite of dynamic work, which is static work. And this is what I'll just be telling you about. The muscles are under tension, contracted, but not actually moving. And the best way to show you what's happening is this diagram here. So when you're doing healthy dynamic work, you need quite a bit of blood, but you're actually getting it, because every time you do this, in that pruning example, you're actually pumping blood through your body. With static work, so this one here, this is your, as an example, your assembly operator in an electric manufacturing plant. The fingers and hands are moving fast, nothing else is moving, you're not getting the blood flow. Now, something I want to try and emphasise here to you is when you go back to your workplaces, try and identify any source of static work that you could build more movement into, or conversely, be very careful if you have dynamic tasks and some of your engineers may think, hey, these tasks are a bit hard for the workers, let's convert them to tasks involving less movement, which is actually bad. There's a lot of that happening. There are design engineers around in the workplace who try and reduce the amount of movement, and they believe it's good ergonomics. And it comes back to this fallacy of motion economy again, where certain people believe that by reducing movement, you're reducing wasted work, but it's not correct. You've got to have movement to keep that blood flowing. And so be very careful about taking a potentially, about taking a dynamic task and converting it to static. And just to show you what I mean there, I think we've got a bit of time, I'll show you a quick video clip. Can we just put the video on? I showed you before the photograph of the guy with the secateurs. And here's the mechanical version. So even though that guy's actually moving, his arms are moving way slower than with the secateurs, and because of the heavy weight of the saw, there's actually quite a severe static component built into that task, as well as the arm movement. Actually, that'll probably do it, thanks. Now the reason I showed you that, that was going back to about the year 2000. We had about 400 people in the bush doing the pruning task with secateurs. Our engineers thought, hey, this is too hard. They were looking at the forces involved, the repetition. They said, we've got to make this easier for the guys. So they tried to mechanise it. Now, after about 8 weeks with those saws, virtually every single person using the saws were pleading to go back to using the secateurs because they had so much pain in the shoulders and arms. Even though there was a bit of movement with the saw, because of the weight of the saw, was essentially static work. They'd taken a good healthy task and turned it static. A place where I worked a few years ago it involved a lot of assembly of components in a factory, and the methods engineers came in one day and did a few time studies, and they figured out how to reduce the number of steps that operators were walking within the plant. Okay, so they were looking at tasks where the operators were maybe only walking, say, 30 steps per hour to start with, to go and get a part from somewhere. The engineers decided, hey, we'll get these parts delivered to the guys, so they don't have to walk at all. And then you see in the reports later on, these engineers say improved ergonomics, reduced number of steps walked, which is absolutely ridiculous. What they've done is further reduce people's benefits of circulation. So again, all I want to do is really encourage you to try and build movement into more into your workplace wherever you can. And I mentioned earlier about the opportunities in hazardous manual tasks to actually save money and make money. And this is one area where I know that some of our competitors are working very hard. About 2 years back, I was at a conference over in South Korea, and I noticed one of the things they were doing there is building movement into tasks in assembly operations in the big factories. And you're talking the big boys there, it's like LG, Samsung, Hyundai, all the big companies. What they're doing is, even though we know it's bad to overreach for something like this, what they're looking at is, what if you could overreach just occasionally to get dynamic muscle movement going, but in such a way that there's no bad leverage effects on your shoulder from doing that. And what some of these companies are now doing is they're making people about every 2 minutes reach out for a part, but when they grab that part, there's a spring loading mechanism or ear loading mechanism which bumps the hand back up. So in effect, they go out, but there's no negative effect of leverage because the hand's being hit back. So they're getting that beautiful effect of the benefit of dynamic movement without any bad effect of overreaching. And to give you an example of the benefits they're getting from that and their production processes, they're saving maybe 1, possibly 2% in the production time. But we're talking about massive organisations. One of these, I can't name the company, but they employ 250,000 people on one site. Okay, this is a company in China. If they can get a 1% saving in the productivity from that, that's equal to saving the wages of 2,500 people. So that's why they can afford to have teams of economists working on this stuff. And if they can get a 1% improvement, they jump in with joy. They've saved a heap of money. And unfortunately, each time one of these huge companies does that and creates that slight improvement, it's another nail in the coffin for manufacturing of smaller countries. Because you need those huge workforces to do this sort of research. So I'm really encouraging you guys, wherever possible, try and really seek out gains like that. I know it's hard for smaller countries, smaller businesses, but if we want to stay competitive, we've got to do that. Just through the slide in here, when I talked about micro pauses before, do you think, is it pretty easy to take a micro pause there? I don't think so. I won't talk about vibration. I think Ty was going to cover that. So before I hand over to our next speakers, I just want to leave you on this note, because I started talking about the code of practice. I'll just finish off on this one. Any person conducting a business or undertaking, so a PCBU, must manage risks to the health and safety relating to a musculoskeletal disorder associated with a hazardous manual task. So remember there's two definitions I showed you at the start, MSD and APT. I've shown you this is straight out of the regulations, so it is law. And they refer to Chapter 3, Part 1, which is this. So just in summing up, this is what you have to do basically in a workplace to control any type of hazard. So I'll leave it there because I know our subsequent speakers are going to carry on with this area. Now, have you guys got any questions, or would you like to hold off till Q&A part at the end? Yeah, okay. Yeah, because it is quite likely that our next two speakers will cover some of your questions anyway, so we'll see how it goes. Okay, so thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Paul. Very informative actually. It's not in my running notes, but what about a micro pause? Does everyone want to stand up for a second, shake it off, and we'll move into the next speaker. I'll give you 30 seconds. Let's hope we have some efficiencies for later on. The next speaker is Heidi Turnbull. Heidi's a certified professional ergonomist and occupational therapist from Pinnacle Workplace Consultants. Heidi's had more than 23 years experience in her field and is here to speak with us today about musculoskeletal injury prevention. So please join me in welcoming Heidi.
Right. Can everybody hear me? Is that on? Yep. It always sounds a little bit different when you're standing up the front. I'll just leave that in my hand. Now, oops. Oh, let me just get to my slides. Oh, there we are. Excellent. So I think that, if we're going off the back of what Paul's talked about there, I suppose I really want to talk a little bit more about you in your own workplaces, what you can do to assess your manual handling tasks and how to determine how those can be hazardous. So I think that's a really difficult question. You can sort of look at a task and say, well, that looks like it could hurt someone, but how do you really know if a task truly is hazardous? How do you sort of measure it for its likelihood to cause injury? So, if we look across different workplaces, we've all got our own different tasks that occur there. This is picking up some sparkling wine out of a bin that's been in storage for a while and is going to get loaded onto a production line, and this needs to be performed probably about a lift every 7 seconds, continuously for about a 4-hour run into a remorge bin, they call them. So very highly repetitive task, and you can see the extreme sort of back angles there that are being performed. This, on the other hand, is another task where we've potentially needed to pull out a worker that's collapsed inside a tank and have pulled it out here. So once again, completely different extremes, but a lot of force in order to be able to safely remove a worker from a confined space. And then if we're looking at another area of manually handling of people, if we're looking at aged care, hospital settings, we've got the handling of people as well, which we've got some unpredictable loads that could have a combative person that perhaps doesn't want to get out of bed, can potentially cause some forces on the body that can potentially cause injury. So Paul, mentioned the Hazardous Manual Task Code of Practice, which is a really good place to start, just to give you some ideas as to what could potentially be some certain hazards related to a particular task within your workforce. If you go to the back of the Code of Practice, there is a checklist document. Has anybody looked at the Hazardous Manual Task and looked at that checklist in the back? It just poses some, good questions, I think, as far as prompts to be able to think, oh, yes, we do have that in this particular task or not, and so on. Unfortunately, probably some things which, if perhaps you'd been to my previous session a couple of weeks ago, doesn't really flesh out on the psychosocial factors that can be related to a task. So we need to look at those elements within work as well. But if we look at the checklist here, for an example, it says, does the work task involve any lifting, lowering or carrying of heavy loads? So I suppose my question to you is, what's heavy for me? What's heavy for me could be different than what's heavy for Paul, could be whatever's heavy for any of you in that workforce. So how do we really determine whether or not something is heavy? How do we determine how awkward a particular task is? Well, it kind of looks a little bit awkward, but perhaps what is awkward for perhaps somebody who might weigh 120 kilograms may not be all that awkward for somebody that weighs 60, 65 kilograms, just because of the size of their body. So we need to take those different types of factors into consideration when we're looking at our workforce. How do we account for fatigue, of performing a task continuously throughout a particular workday, or in an environment that could be outdoors, or in some very humid or cold conditions, and obviously accounting for those psychosocial factors. So for today, I'm going to just be talking about why you should use some standardised risk assessment tools, which I'll be presenting. We're going to be looking at the benefits of using those risk assessment tools, and I'll take you through 5 tools, those top 5 there, which are quite reasonably readily available, and also take you through a whole body vibration app which is available now as well, if that is something that could be affecting or your workers could be exposed to. And just as a note, if anybody is interested, these presentation notes will be getting made available afterwards, so there's no need to be scribbling down madly if you are along the way. And then I just want to go through some practical examples of trying to use these tools, just so you've got a little bit of an idea, how you would actually go through each of those. So if we're looking at using a standardised tool, what are the benefits there of using them? Well, they're going to eliminate any type of cultural variations. So if you've looked at different women in different cultural groups given childbirth, you will notice that there can be quite extremes as to the amount of apparent discomfort or pain that they might be experiencing. So for those of us in the room that have experienced that, we've all got our own personal experience, but there is variation across cultures in how people experience more strenuous types of tasks. We can look at personal biases of the assessor. Once again, I've got my idea as to what I think is heavy generally for a working population. Paul, as an advisor, might have his kind of own sort of personal biases. They might vary across people that are evaluating the task. It does allow for a comparison across industries, and also gives the ability to have some sort of valid type of measurement of those different work tasks as well. And above all, I suppose we want some degree of repeatability of anybody being able to do it time and time again and produce the same type of result. So there's some of the reasons why we want to use them. Other benefits of using a standardised risk assessment tool include quantifying the level of risk based on some actual data. So, all these tools here have been based on a lot of research and data that has been performed either from a biomechanical perspective on the body or on humans and individuals to try to come up with some sort of guidelines as to what could be too much for a particular worker as well. They're also good in evaluating change or the impact of implementing a control measure within your workforce. And this is probably one of the main benefits that I think can be so useful to yourself in company. Who needs to justify the dollars that they spend on safety in their company? Yep, you're thinking, how do you get that justification? How do you say, look, this is really a problem. I upfront money to buy this piece of equipment. So if you can objectively show, using some of these tools, the actual change in risk or, a risk exposure to the worker, that can give you more ammunition to potentially get those dollars for your workforce to implement those changes. And obviously we want to have something that's a little bit more evidence-based, which is really what we should all be about. We want to base it on evidence, just not personal opinion. So the tools that I'm going to show you, or at least talk about this, I suppose generally speaking, I'm just coming from a consultant's viewpoint, fall a little bit into two categories as far as the types of tasks that you would be looking at to use them in. So the ones that I've got here are tools that I would say, if you look at a task, it's kind of like you're wanting to take a snapshot of that task. So this is those workers reaching into that remorge bin to pick up their sparkling wine. I go, wow, that's a really extreme angle there, and they're picking up 2 bottles of wine in each hand and having to do that repetitively. So I look at that task and I go, gee, that actual posture right there is really want to look at the risks associated with that. So some programs or tools that I would look at, and I'll talk about these a little bit more, the 3D SSPP program, the REBA or the Rapid Entire Body Assessment Tool, the ruler, the Rapid Upper Limb Assessment Tool, and the Revised Night Lifting Equation. So they're a few tools there. If, however, I'm wanting to really look at an activity, sort of you're kind of looking generally at an activity that workers need to perform in their workplace, picking up, various things, kind of, there's kind of a whole range of tasks like that. I might look more broadly at some of these. So the Snook and Sirioli tables, the Living Mutual manual material handling tables, or the Mantra assessment that was developed up in Queensland. So these, really looking more at, just kind of more broadly a whole task, not a particular posture per se within a task, but something that we can use more broadly. Now also a factor that we look at, you need to know where your data has come from and how a particular assessment tool is useful, and really looking at, I suppose, the different sort of approaches that tools have been developed from. So I just wanted to talk briefly about these just so that you've got a little bit better understanding of those. And we can see here that 4 of the main approaches would be a biomechanical perspective as far as a risk assessment tool, so really looking at specific forces and loads within a structure within the body. Then we're looking at a physiological approach, psychophysical and approaches and risk assessment tools which use all of those. So when we're looking at the biomechanical tools, the 3D SSPP program is one of those tools which you can use, and it's basically looking at identifying the maximum forces that certain body structures, commonly the lumbar spine, can withstand under certain loads. So it's really looking at, does the particular work task exceed those maximum loads that we know the lumbar spine discs, for example, can withhold. So we're looking at shear forces as well, and we're really estimating their exposure. So that's like a bit of a screenshot of the type of program there, and where you can find out more information about that particular program. The physiological tools, they are a little bit more based on really looking at energy expenditure of a body. So if you're looking at, I suppose, the upshot of wanting to ensure that people move a lot, as what Paul was talking about in his presentation, well, the negatives of moving a lot is that people can actually move too much to the point of getting fatigued. So is the workload placed on the worker that great that they're likely to actually, get just physically drained by the time they've finished their work shift every day, go home, collapse on the couch, and then turn up to work again the next day. So when we look at that, we can see that there's the energy expenditure prediction program, which is another program developed by the same people, University of Michigan, that's also available, and there's a set guideline. I won't talk you through that one because it's a little bit more complex to use, but once again, it could be something that could be useful if that is a particular concern in your workforce. Then we've got physical tools which are available, and they're really looking at the Snook and Sirioli tables and the Liberty Mutual manual material handling tables, which are basically based off the same data which originally developed from Snook and Sirioli. So what happened there is basically they took a whole heap of people and workers, and I'll say conditioned workers, so we're not talking about just any Joe Bloggs off the street, and they asked them to be handling certain amounts of weight in a very systematic approach. You know, one lift every 5 seconds, one lift every 30 seconds, one lift every minute, 5 minutes, etc. And ask them, you know, how comfortably could you keep up this work rate for? So it was, I suppose, a subjective type tool, but over looking at hundreds of people, they actually developed some, I suppose, normative data, and they looked at that from a male and female perspective as well. So getting that differences, and there's actually some very good tables if you've ever had a look at them, with a lot of data behind them as well in looking at those. Then we have tools that combine all three of these, and that's where we get to the revised NIOSH lifting index, which is also quite a good tool. Once again, predominantly looking at lifting elements of tasks, but it does combine all of those different elements. So it is looking at the energy expenditure, looking at the mechanical load on different joints, and also bringing into play those psychophysical elements as well. Let's start off with 3D SSPP. I suppose I'll firstly say it is quite an expensive program to buy if you are looking at it available through the US. I've not actually looked up recently how much it costs, but I would probably say it may well be, for its usability, a little too cost prohibitive to actually utilise. But effectively, you know, when I've used the program, you would take a snapshot of the task that you're looking at. You actually manipulate the little man on the screen to adopt a very similar type of posture. You plug in the values for whatever the weight or the force is that you know that they're having to handle, and then it tells you whether or not you're likely to exceed any of those shear force or weight load limits in the body. So it does give you some very valuable information, but it's quite a technical sort of program to use. So I wouldn't see that, you know, unless you do a lot of this sort of stuff, which I do a reasonable amount of, it may not be all that beneficial. So it is costly, but you know, it is reproducible. You get some data as far as known forces, etc. I want to say there is stuff like this out there that you can purchase if that does really float your boat. All right, let's move on to the NIOSH lifting index. This is a tool that I do use certainly from time to time. It does have its benefits. And basically what you would use it for is if you're looking at a task and you want to know how much weight can people safely handle, or what is the recommended weight limit for performing this task. So it might be a fairly, maybe reasonably repetitive sort of manual handling task, etc. But it's really looking at taking some very specific measurements of the task that is replicated over a period of time, and it's asking people to look at the horizontal distance that the load is away from the body at the start, the vertical distance that the object is actually lifted, the frequency of the lift, how long, the duration of the task itself, whether there's any degree of trunk rotation that's required during the lift itself, and also the coupling or the handholds that are documented. And it takes all of those factors into consideration and basically tells you, given the parameters of those different elements, what the recommended weight limit is for that task. You can then take that information and go, oh, okay, well this program tells me that 8 kilograms is the recommended weight limit. We're actually getting people to lift 12 in this task. So maybe that's a bit of an issue or a factor that we need to play around with there. So I won't go through all the details of this, but basically what it does is that it basically looks at what that recommended weight limit is in comparison to what you are handling, And if you do a ratio between those two, if you have a ratio of less than 1, everything's great, you're doing well. If you've got a ratio of greater than 1, then you know that people would be at an increased risk of potentially suffering from a potential back injury in relationship to that. And the very last point down the bottom, if you've got a ratio of greater than 3, then it's likely that almost all workers would be at risk of sustaining an injury in those very extreme motions. So some of the limitations of it are that they have end range movement. So if we were looking at unloading the bins, those remorge bins with bottles, the furthest reach away from the body that it talks about is 63 centimetres, which is about the length of my arm. Okay, so if you're having to pick anything up further than 63 centimetres away from your body, it doesn't even take that into consideration. That goes, nope, that's too far away, it's a risk, regardless. So that kind of threw my remorge bin bottle lifting task. I was like, okay, well, that's too dangerous. I can't use that. So there are some limitations that it just sort of has some load limits that it won't even go near. But at least you know it's a risk if it is outside those parameters. But there are some definite positives to you. It is definitely reproducible. The parameters are fairly easy to measure. It's freely available as far as on the internet that you can go, and it does provide you a basis for looking at some design guidelines. If you're wanting to look at making some changes to the design of the work environment, you can see what element it is within all of those different sort of sub categories that is the highest risk. So if you can try to engineer that out, then you can obviously increase the amount that people can safely lift performing that sort of task. Negatives, it does focus on the lower back only. So if that's all that you're looking at, that's what we'll look with. Getting the measurements can be a little bit fiddly because you're literally looking at specific measurements for each of those different parameters. It doesn't account for energy expenditure again, so it won't take into account fatigue-related issues with manual handling tasks. And it really is looking at a single equation for males and females. So it's taking into consideration the female population. So actually some of the load limits for a predominantly male population would seem a little bit low. So, I would think a male population can actually, is capable of doing more than what this tool would actually provide benefit for. The other negatives related with the NIOSH is that it only it doesn't give parameters for any one-handed lifts that may be required, so it always has to be two-handed. It doesn't look at tasks that could be greater than 8 hours in duration. It doesn't account for work that could be seated, so it has to be in a standing position or work in a restricted space. So you're really looking at sort of ideal lifting scenarios that you would be basing this on, which once again, how many people have got an ideal lifting scenario in their workforce? No one? So, there's your hazard there. So yeah, we can look at that. But once again, it can be a useful tool if you're just looking at particular postures which people are adopting and looking at specific heights through which people can perform the task. So with NIOSH, as far as looking at its availability on site, you can actually go, I've got the link there on the handout, and actually is that handout that I had all the links available for everyone today to take? I had a handout, hopefully it is, that's got all of those written down. So you can actually download an Excel sort of file that does all the calculations for you. There's an app for it as well. So if you really like to make sure you've always got a risk management tool with you wherever you go, you can download it onto your smartphone. Quite easy to plug in the values there. Or if you prefer a paper-based method, you can download the whole manual off the website as well and formulate it through using the paper-based method as well. Now, the Liberty Mutual Manual Material Handling Table is probably a tool that I use a lot in my workforce. It's very easily accessible off the website. You can plug in all sorts of numbers and try to work out a lot of things. So this was the data that was based on getting a whole team of different seasoned employees to go in and do these lifting tasks over and over again, repeatability at different sort of frequencies and weights across the way. And then they came up with these population-based tables, which is there's ones for males, ones for females, and they basically look at lifting between 3 different zones. So those lifts that are inquire something like below knuckle height, so knuckle height being probably about the height of this stool here, so anything below that point, knuckle to shoulder height roughly, and then anything above shoulder height as well. So there's kind of 3 different zones that you can look at lifting in. And of course we all know that lifting, we have different strengths and abilities based on those different zones through which we're lifting. I can't lift as much above shoulder height than what I could at waist height or what I could from the floor. So we can go to the web link here and plug in some different values for that particular tool. So it has data for any lifting tasks, lowering tasks, carrying, and pushing and pulling. So there's actually quite a few different elements that we can be looking at in using this tool. And you basically, if I get this pointer right, you're basically selecting on the website which different element up here. It's got tables for, you select whether it's male or female for all of those different tasks working your way down there, and then you just quite simply, it tells you to plug in the information. The only downside of it is American based, so it's all the measurements are in inches, so you need your calculator there to convert all of your measurements into inches that you would have taken. Alright, so some of the factors that it takes into consideration is looking at lifting and lowering weights, looking at the different height through which you're lifting, the number of lifts per minute, how far away your hands are away from your body when the load is being handled, so that could be based on the size of the object that you're handling, the vertical distance that it's being lifted or lowered, and where it starts or ends during that process as well. And then there's the carrying and pushing and pulling elements. Pros and cons to it. Hang on, I skipped past the slide there. Let's go back. It's very quick and easy to use. You can plug in lots of numbers quite easily. It does account for repetitive lifting, so you can really look at, if you're in an industry where there's a lot of frequent lifting, this would be a really good tool to use for that. The tasks performed were realistic simulations of industrial workers, so it's more lifelike or readily usable in your particular circumstances. The results are reproducible, and it differentiates between sexes, which is great. The cons are there is, for high frequency tasks, some of the loads that are, I suppose, higher than what we would normally see recommended metabolic criteria. So some of the weights that it's recommending may actually be heavier than from an energy expenditure viewpoint we would otherwise recommend. So that's where, once again, we're looking at the comparison between 2 different tools, that hasn't been taken into consideration. It doesn't account for any twisting, bending, or any type of load asymmetry. So what I do is I plug in my raw data values. I then look at the work task and say, well, actually, even though I know I've got a box that weighs 22 kilograms that the workers have to lift, I actually know it's actually a little bit of an awkward lift because it's in a tub that the worker actually has to bend over to reach up to pull out. Now this tool is based on ideal lifting parameters, so this is just squatting, picking up a box, putting it on a table per se. It's not accounting for the fact that I'm actually bending and putting braided shear forces through my lumbar spine. So I would take whatever results this program tells me and then go, well, actually, I actually think it's a bit lower than that, given I know that there's a more awkward element associated with the task that I'm physically looking at. And it doesn't account for the shape or the size of the box or whatever it is that you're lifting as well. All right, so let's look at the ruler, the rapid upper limb assessment. So this was developed by an Australian, or a couple of Australians actually, and it's really looking at postural loading. It's quite good if you're really concerned about whether there are awkward postures that are being adopted or how awkward they are. This would be a type of tool that you would be looking at, and this obviously mainly focuses on the upper body. So basically anything that's predominantly based on trunk, neck, shoulders, elbows, wrist, forearms, hands, etc. It really is focusing on those. So potentially if it's a sedentary workforce and you're looking at particular maybe production line type tasks or whatever, this is a good place to start. It enables a quick assessment of some key postures in relationship to your body and helps you to identify whether, I suppose from their perspective, actions need to be implemented. There is a worksheet which you work your way through, which you can either download off the internet. There are, I'll show you in a while, Excel programs that you can also download, and it really takes you through the postures for that element. And I think it'll probably be easier for me to explain. I've got an example that we actually work through the whole process so that you can sort of see what you physically do to get your results there. Let me just move along to the next slide there. As you can see here, it really is looking at giving a bit of a scoring code for what position different parts of the body are in when they're performing that task. Now, as you all know, I mean, most manual tasks are movement related, so what snapshot of the task are you really evaluating here when you're actually taking it? So I suppose I'd be looking at the worst case scenario, but that's not always the factor that we're looking at. So it is that snapshot, as I mentioned before, kind of more posture based. What's probably the predominant posture that workers are having to adopt when they're performing this task, and basically going through and making a judgment as to where that body part is in relationship to the diagrams here. And then it's basically scoring them likewise through that system. It's very quick and easy to use. You can just fill in your score sheet or go online to one of the programs and just kind of plug in based on, you might have taken a photograph of that particular work task when a worker was performing it to get a bit of an idea. And it's relatively accurate in its measurements there. I suppose probably from my perspective, one of the key downsides of it is that if I evaluated me standing at this lectern talking to you, it would probably rate this as at least a low to moderate risk. The risk ratings in the original format of this tool are actually rated quite high. So even me just looking straight forward with my neck or even slightly downwards automatically triggers a sort of an awkward posture, sort of a score. So it actually is quite sensitive towards identifying risk rather than realistically, actually that's probably a pretty good posture to be in performing that task. So I know the university lecturers over at La Trobe Uni in the Ergonomics and Human Factors program there, they've actually developed their own revised tool of this where they've actually taken 1 point off each of the different body posture movements and have come up with their own revised format of it. So just a word of warning, if you're looking at it and you're getting really high scores, maybe just lower it down a little bit and that would be a more realistic judge of where you're at. All right, the Reba. Okay. Exactly the same tool, developed by the same people, however it's looking at the whole body. So this time, the same types of factors, but we're looking at lower back, hip, knee, ankle postures as well into play. Pretty much the same sort of scenario. You're filling in one of these score sheet factors and coming up with an overall score as to whether or not it's something that's relatively safe or low risk, or something that requires immediate action, or you need to look at changing it soon. The Reba, there's an app for it as well on your iPhone. I've also got it on my iPhone, so anytime I can just plug in some values and very quickly work them out. I should say that the ruler, there is an app for it as well. However, it's clearly not the same software developers, and it's a little bit clunky to use. So this app developer definitely is much easier to use if you want to look at having those available on your tablet or iPhone. All right, the last one to quickly go through is the Mantra, which is a tool developed by some ergonomists up in Queensland, Gary Dennis, and Robert Burgess Limerick. Thank you, Sally. Basically, once again, this is kind of looking more broadly at a sort of a whole manual handling task. So with this, it looks at 4 different areas of the body, being the lower limb, the back, neck and shoulders, and then more hand, wrist, forearm area. And it's asking you to rate characteristics of that task within each bandwidth of the body. It's asking you to look at the cycle time through which there is body movement performed, the force that would be, or the amount of muscle effort, speed, the awkwardness, and whether there's any exposure to vibration. So it's asking you as an evaluator to judge all of those elements, and there's a bit of a scale that you can use. I'll bring that up. So you're kind of plugging in your values here, and this table kind of gives you some guidelines as to whether it's very fast movement, like what Paul was talking about, whether it's like smooth, slow movement patterns, the degree of exertion. Now that's a good example. We've got 1 minimal force, 3 moderate, and 5 maximal force. How do you kind of judge what's maximal force? I mean, I can look at somebody's, if they're really clenching their fists or really looking like they're in a lot of pain, but it requires a little bit of assessor sort of bias or judgment there to say whether or not you feel it's going to be a certain degree of force. So, and once again, me lifting 25 kilograms, that could be quite challenging for me. Get Saudi to lift it, he could just pick it up with a piece of cake. So it's kind of going to be dependent on the actual person themselves as to whether they are actually looking like they're exerting a lot of force performing that task. So I'll also go through an example of that one so that you've got a bit of an idea as to how to actually use it a little bit later. So it gives you an action point with the scoring, which basically tells you whether or not you should be making some changes. It doesn't score work environments, the gripping nature of a task, or static muscle loading, which once again Paul was talking about was a very important element. And the assessment is relevant to the individual being assessed, as I just mentioned before. And as I said, it is kind of open to the assessor's judgment in using it. So the repeatability of these could be, quite different based on different people performing the test. So there are a few ones just to kind of give you an orientation to the tool. What I wanted to do now is physically go through how you would actually use it, because that's, the bottom line. You guys want to walk away from here and feel like you've got a much better understanding of how to use them. So I thought I'd start off with the NIOSH lifting index first. So basically what we have here, I'll go back to the previous slide. So we've got very basic task here, lifting a box from an overhead shelf down onto a more sort of waist height shelf there. So just looking at a particular task there. We'll say that this person is putting away stock in their stockroom environment, and we've just taken some parameters. There could be a number of different boxes that need to be put away within a specific zone. So with a NIOSH equation, what you're talking about, we are talking from the point that the lift begins, so the origin, and then going to the destination. So there's 2 different calculations for those different elements. And I'm plugging in each of these different values. So I am, and I'll just make sure I can point my pointer on the right area here. H being the horizontal distance that the box is away from the body. So I take a measurement which is halfway between the worker's ankles, so you're getting down on your hands and knees to do this, and measuring straight down to the centre of gravity of the box, what that distance is there. Okay? Then I'm looking at the vertical height from which the box is travelling. I've just plugged that in. Oh, sorry, that's the height it's going to, the travel distance, which we've said is 65 centimetres, this distance there from the shelf down to this one. The angle of asymmetry. So this would be if there was any rotational forces that the worker would need to go through. In this case, there's not any. The coupling, which is how well the person can get a grip on the box. Is it something that's very difficult to grip, or could be slippery, or requires extra sort of force to get a really good hold on it? In this case, it's a box, so it's got pretty good handhold, so we don't say that that's an issue. We look at the frequency of the lift, and for this exercise, I've said there's one lift every 5 minutes. The weight of the box could be anywhere from 8, a maximum of 10, and the duration of the task is 1 hour. So they're all the elements that I'm plugging in for the beginning of the lift and the end of the lift. Then, basically, I plug in that information into, there's some tables, and it basically identifies the level of risk. The closer that value is there to 1, the safer it is. So 1 is the maximum and the most safe, and then everything less than 1 is a factor which is multiplying out the risk of that particular load. So I go down there, I've got these different factors all the way down there, and then it tells me what, the recommended weight limit is for that task. So I've got a 9.7 based on the values or the lifting criteria of that particular task. So that's told me in comparison to my, why did I put 7 there? That should have been probably an 8. So bottom line, I know that my actual lift amount is less than the recommended weight limit there. Now, if that was a larger number than my recommended weight limit, then I would know that there was a risk there. And ultimately, that would be a 1.5 or a 2 or something like that. So I know that there's quite a bit more risk elevated there. So I can look at some different, I can look at that from a design perspective and say, what do I want to change about this lift or this task to make it easier to perform. I'll keep moving on so we get to this. Now the Liberty Mutual tables. For these, we've got a task here that we've got some 25 kilogram bags of mulch that need to be moved. The lifts of the bags, we've got about 20 that need to be loaded into a wheelbarrow, pushed to where they need to go, and then unloaded at the end. So there's 40 lifts in total. It's performed over the whole day. The distance of the handholds away from the body is about 25 centimetres, and the lifting distance to get them up off the ground into the wheelbarrow and then back down again is about 50 centimetres or so. So how do I look at this? I'm going to show you these tables here manually, how to work through it. But effectively what you're doing is that you're looking at the weight of the object first here, and once again, this is American, so it's pounds. So I did a calculation and it's about 55 pounds, a 25 kilogram bag. So we'll put a circle around 56 here because that's around where it should be. Then I'm looking at that distance that my hands are away from the body. So 25 centimetres in inches is 10 inches. Good thing I used to work in America. Then I'm looking at how frequently that lift is performed. So I've got here 1 lift every, I think that's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, etc. Then I've got 5 minutes there. So we'll use that as a basis. And then I come down this column and see where they intersect, and I've got a little value here. So what this tells me is that for the male working population, 73% of the male working population could safely perform that task given those parameters. Okay? So, and I can see on those tables elsewhere, if I have a few different factors in play, what could actually increase that percentage or not. So you're really looking at, given an average working population, what percentage of the population can perform that task, and that's going to really give you your judgment of your risk. If that value was 40%, then you kind of know, gee, actually this is actually quite a heavy task, it's only 40% of the population could actually do it. And then if you plug in those same values for a female worker, well then your percentages are actually going to be lower again, looking at that. So it allows you to look at the level of risk based on population-based data. Does that make sense to people? Yep. So you can fiddle around with this. Once again, you can go online and actually use the online tool, which goes through those exact same parameters. But once once again, have your calculator handy because you do need to do that conversion of inches to, or centimetres to inches, etc. And we've got all those different variables that we are looking at along the way there. All right, so now let's look at the Reba tool, which the Reba and Ruler, they work very much the same. And we'll take through that. So here we're really looking at a snapshot of that posture that the worker's having to adopt, and we're rating the posture against these scales here. So first one, I'm looking at the neck, trunk and limb analysis. So I'm looking at here the location of the neck. So up here I've got a neck posture, so I need to be careful because this person is on a bit of a tilt here. So perhaps I've rated that as, well, he's only got about 10 to 20 degrees of looking his head down there, so I've circled that a 1. Then I'm looking at the trunk angulation, which is a little bit more. So I'm looking across all of these trunk angulations and going, well, I reckon there's about that much degree of trunk flexion going on there, so I'm going to rate that a 3. Then I look at where those two sort of intercept and I get a 2. I'll just say the worksheet is a little bit hard to follow, the app much easier. Okay, so you're effectively following through and rating each of these. So we've got the trunk, the leg position, and we're getting a score in each of these coloured squares, and that's telling you where to put your values in along the way. Keep following up through, and I've got another slide here. I'm then looking at the upper limb score, so looking at the same sort of elements of scoring for each of those. So I've kind of got to work in one area, look into that, and then see where they intersect, so that I end up with an overall score. So I'm adding together a score from the C table here, together with an activity score, and I'm getting an overall Reba score of a 6, which basically gives you a certain level of scoring there. So it gives you a value of risk indicated there for each particular task. So if I get a 6, basically that's telling me that there's a medium risk factor and I need to investigate further or change elements of that task soon once I've worked through that. So obviously the ruler is the same type of principle, but it's just focused on the upper body and neck. Once again, this looks like a lovely working posture, doesn't it? Is that how some people work at their computer workstations sometimes, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon? So same exact principles, starting off rating each of the different positions of the arm, the forearm position, wrist angulation and orientation, and then it's looking at how much muscle effort is involved, force, and then doing a bit of a table there. Once you actually look at the tables and follow through, it sort of makes sense how you follow through that particular value, but then it will give you an overall score at the end. In this case, that's given me an end rating of a 5, which falls into that category again of needing to change soon, which is pretty evident of looking at that particular task. So, but what I use this for is say, well, what elements could I actually change to make this task less injury prone? So if I had well, what do you think, guys? You know, maybe the bench itself could be changed that the person's working on, where he can actually get his legs underneath the bench as a first place to go, so he can actually pull his stool in a little bit closer, maybe increasing the height of the microscope so that he's going to be in a more upright position. So you can actually do a before and after kind of effect, or what you'd like to do, and you can see how the score has changed in those different elements. The mantra, we've got a cleaning task here, could be in an aged care facility or in a hospital type setting of needing to change that, or even think what you might do at home. And you're basically rating each of these elements through those 4 different areas of the body. So I'm evaluating what the lower limb is doing, the back is doing, the neck and shoulder, and then the wrist, hand and forearm. I'm looking at the total time that the task is performed for, and I've got a rating system here. Then I'm looking at the duration of the whole task, so these ones will always be the same for it, and the cycle time of the whole task. So these elements will always be the same for all of the four areas. But then I'm looking at the repetition. I'm looking at a basis of force there, which is different. So clearly the amount that I'm needing to push with my shoulders and push with my wrist and forearm is going to be different. It's going to be a degree going through my lower back as well. And then I'm looking at the speed of the movements here based on these rating scales. So I will know that there will be fairly sort of, reasonably fast movements of my upper limb performing that task, which I'm looking at there. At the end of the day, when you've plugged in all those values, you get a cumulative score here, and our little guide down the bottom here says that action needs to be taken if the exertion factor is greater than 5. So that is this element here, which it doesn't fall into that category there. We've only got a couple of 4s. The sum of the exertion and awkwardness is 8 or greater. So putting those two elements there together, I've got 9, so I know that there's definitely a force and awkwardness factor, or the cumulative score is 15 or greater. So I'm not quite meeting that benchmark there. So I have on one element said that that could be a awkward task. All right. So last one I wanted to talk about is the whole body vibration app. This is an app that's probably been out for about 18 months, and it's really opened up the environment to people such as yourselves downloading an app onto your iPhone and actually getting some pretty good, actually valid readings for whole body vibration. I've messed around with it in my car and travelled to work with it and have been a bit shocked with the values, but it actually allows you to get some really good data if that is a particular area of concern. So if you've got forklift drivers, delivery drivers, any sort of, truck or vehicle that people are travelling in, you can actually get some quite good measurements of vibration, and then the app actually very well measures it against the standards that are in place. So all you do is take a trial time of, I'll show you what you do with it. You would put your device underneath your one butt cheek and drive around with it like that. And then it basically gives you a readout at the end of the trial as to where your vibration levels fall within the two values of the VDV and the RMS scores for that. And if we're talking about this, it's really the Z factor, which is the vibration up and down motion, which is the critical one because we're looking at compressive forces through the spine as we're utilising that. So these were some trials that I did with a company that was looking at, we actually looked at a few different vehicles across their fleet and looked at the amount of vibration through those different model vehicles, and actually were able to substantiate that there were particular vehicles which, given their suspension systems, whatever, the makeup of the trucks, actually were producing higher levels of vibration or exposing the workers to higher levels of vibration than others. So that then gave them the ability to really, looking at their fleet management, to say, well, actually we want to make sure that we're purchasing a vehicle not of this make and going with a model which had a lower ability to cause the exposure of vibration. The research that's been done on this, I suppose I have to give you a caution, it was only done on an iPod 5 model on the particular accelerometers in those models. Now, I just happen to have an iPod 5, or my daughter did anyway, so that's what I've been using. So it's only been tested on iPhones as far as the research that's been performed. So as far as the validity across other devices, we don't know because the research hasn't been conducted on those yet. However, from an iPod device, I would say that the level of accelerometer within the iPhone is compared to the actual testing equipment that is available, which is quite expensive to purchase and then have come out to trial, was within about a 5% error rate. And really, I'm just thinking if you're trying to get a bit of a benchmark, I think a 5% error rate is quite realistic for the type of work that you would be looking at. If you want to get the real experts out and do that, certainly do. But for a free app that you can download off the internet and get a pretty good judge. I think this is a good way to start. As far as some other risk assessment tools, and the handout that I have has got some of these listed on there, you might want to look at the Health Safety Executives MAC tool or Manual Activity tool that they have. So that's out of the UK, that's another format. If you're looking more specifically at specific upper limb characteristics in your workforce, you might want to look at the Revised Strain Index or the threshold limit values for upper limb and localised fatigue assessment tool, which is actually quite good. I suppose the big push for me as well is don't forget the psychosocial factors. Okay, so they're very real, very valid factors, and if you really want to look at your workforce and look at assessing those, there's the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, otherwise known as the COPSOC, the Job Content Questionnaire, and the WOAC, which is the Work Organisation Assessment Questionnaire, which assess looking at those sort of job content, psychosocial factors in your workplace, which will, you know, come to light some other factors there. But I know for some work groups it can be something that can be a little bit of a touchy conversation, because it's really looking at, you know, how good a support do you receive in your work environment? How good is your communication with your manager? You know, are you under time pressures in your management, etc. So all those types of things can be a little bit sensitive for some employers to actually gain information back on in those ways. All right, so if there's not, are there any specific questions right now that I can answer, or would people prefer once again just to save it until after Saudi has spoken?
You might save it.
Save it? Excellent. All right. Do you want to say some words there?
Thank you, Heidi, and some fantastic tools there. Hopefully you pick your favourite and can go and research that and take that into the workplace and start assessing some of the tasks you may be doing. But we'll just take a short break, 10 minutes, and help yourselves out the front. I assume the refreshments will still be out there if you want to. Welcome back. Okay, so we're going to move now on to our third speaker for the afternoon, Saudi Lee. Saudi works as an evaluator for Return to Work SA. He manages self-insured private employers, assisting them in complying with the performance standards in work health and safety and injury management. So welcome, Saudi.
Thank you. Just checking this. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
Good. Well, it's exciting to be in front in this cinema. This is honestly the first time I've spoken in this sort of environment. So if you can bear with me with this light, I sort of feel a bit awkward with it shining in my face constantly. So thank you for coming, and I think you'll all agree that safety is an important topic, and certainly it's really important for everybody in the room to actually learn and get some useful information about. It's exciting for me to collaborate with Safe Work SA again. I've worked with as a senior inspector before, and it's good to meet old faces and work together as well. This session is also in collaboration with the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, so I should give a little bit more of a plug about HFESA. HFESA is basically the Association for Ergonomists and Human Factors Professionals. So the definition of human factors or ergonomics, and the term is used interchangeably, is really around the scientific discipline that's concerned with understanding the interactions of humans in elements or within systems, and the profession that actually looks at data, information, methods, research to design systems to optimise a person's overall performance, as well as optimise the organisation or the system's performance as well. So it isn't all about bums, backs and chairs, as most people would think of economics. Now, Paul asked me to talk about how to manage hazardous manual tasks from an evaluator perspective. Basically put it in a safety management system context. But he also said that the majority of the audience will be from small and medium-sized organisations. So to me, that posed a bit of a challenge because I'm used to dealing with large organisations and essentially evaluating large safety management systems. What I'll do though is what I've done is put together some key processes and principles that I'll explain that I believe can be applied in any setting, large or small, in terms of organisations. There we go. A bit about myself, very briefly. I started professional life as an occupational therapist, have had further experience and qualifications in safety and ergonomics, and worked, as I said, as a senior inspector at Safe Work SA before, and have had management roles in managing teams in safety and injury management. Basically what I do now combines most of those skill sets in evaluating what we call self-insured employers, which are basically large employers that categorised differently for various reasons which I won't go into, and looking at essentially auditing their systems and I guess judging them in a way in terms of how well they perform and whether they comply with our expectations. So I've been in this role for about 10 years, which has flown by really quickly. And yeah, that's basically what we do. And I find this, although a bit nerve-wracking, I actually enjoy explaining things in a non-confrontational sense as opposed to an audit or like the inspectors and when they investigate and do inspections. As a bit of a recap, now I know Paul didn't actually talk much about the legislation and code of practice. If we can all agree that following his approach, if we can all agree that there is legislation out there and it is an obligation to basically have a safety system that tries to reduce, if not eliminate, risks at work, then I think we can move forward and talk about things more productively. And I guess what I'll talk about might not necessarily seem like a legislative obligation, but if you can trust me, it is based on legislation and it does complement and it does help demonstrate that you are meeting legislative requirements. Heidi talked about a range of risk assessment tools, and there's actually a lot more out there that you can use. Some obviously cost a little bit and some are readily available. So I'll try and combine all those aspects into this session. Now, just a sort of a bit of a light sort of humour. My session is not designed to convince you one way or the other that one method is better than another. So hopefully I'm preaching to the converted and you're all interested in safety and you all believe that it's an important thing to have in your business. So I guess the one thing I would say is that from a Return to Work SA perspective, we were called WorkCover, so for all those of you who weren't aware that we changed our name. I just want to also clarify that I'm not prescribing anything in particular and that the key processes that I'll go through and principles I'll go through is really up to anybody to consider and adopt in their workplace. So, might as well go through them all. We have our own standard. It's called the Workout Safety Performance Standard, and if anybody has seen Australian Standards 4801, it's very similar to that. It's basically a standard that we use to gauge and compare different organisations' safety management system. It follows basically a plan, do, check, act cycle, and there's actually 5 components which are called standards in themselves. Standard 1, just really briefly, I won't go through all the sub-elements and elements, but standard 1 is all around your documented approach and your supporting policies and procedures. Standard 2 is around your planning approach. It may be in your business plans, your action plans, your strategic plans, and it's essentially trying to promote that you do things in a planned, proactive manner to achieve safety outcomes. Standard 3 is about everything that you do in terms of implementing the things that you commit to in your procedures as well as your plans, and there are a few little elements that might not readily fit in Standard 1 and 2, which is described in Standard 3. Standard 4 is about measurement and monitoring. Typically, in large organisations, it's through internal audit, but there are other methods and ways to monitor what you do, and certainly it's expected that you monitor whatever you plan to do, you actually monitor and make sure that you do it and it's maintained. Standard 5 is basically closing the loop, so that we expect any organisation to periodically evaluate their system, analyse good, bad or indifferent, the things that they do, and what works, what doesn't work, and as relevant, pat yourself on the back, but also work out things that you can do to improve things over time. Now, most organisations will have their own unique safety management system. I haven't come across any organisation that has the exact same system. So this sort of picture resembles elements that you might be familiar with that might be present in your system, but it certainly wouldn't be your exact system. So, for example, the second box up there, if the pointer works, management standards. I generally find that management standards are only designed and in place for large international, if not national, organisations. And they're sort of used the same way that we use our standards to compare different businesses, and if it's within an organisation, compare different business units. Other organisations will have a variety of different procedures and tools. Some organisations won't have strategic procedures, and some will, and obviously the forms and checklists will be different depending on your business. So the key message is really, it's up to the organisation or your business to design something that works for you, that fits in your business model, and that you can legitimately sustain and improve over time. Now, a key sub-element in our standard that we require and look at, but also connects to all the other sub-elements in the standards, is sub-element 1.2.1 that requires the organisation to have supporting policies and procedures that, well, it supports your principal policy statement, your safety policy, that basically describes what you do, how you do things, and how you achieve a safe outcome for your workers. It's essentially the basis of any safety management system, and it's basically means that whatever you find important, critical, that's really that you want to make sure gets done in any consistent, structured, time-bound way, that you document it so that people who can access your system or should follow your system can have a consistent source of instructions to follow that they can apply. I've seen quite a number of procedures in the thousands if not millions, and whilst it is important to have a procedural documented approach, it is easier said than done. It's in fact a whole area of ergonomics and human factors in looking at the usability of instructions and whether people actually understand intuitively or otherwise. But I won't go into it in this session. For example, now I sort of observed that it's a quiet crowd, but I'll ask anyway. Can anybody comment and provide and share their time that they've actually gone out to identify a hazardous manual task? Anybody? I was at a very similar workshop last week that some ergonomists from a physio background from Adelaide University and La Trobe University, and they presented their research, and they got us to break up into groups, and they asked us the same thing. Can you work out in your organisation what your procedural requirements are to manage manual handling tasks? And the results of them were pretty much consistent. Most, if not all, weren't able to actually explain what the organisation does in terms of proactively identifying hazardous manual tasks. So, and the examples that were given tended to be reactive or based on an intervention type approach. And the research from that was, or the conclusion from their research was that there's, although they acknowledge that there still is really a high rate of injuries, musculoskeletal injuries, and although it hasn't increased, substantially, exponentially much more, it's still a really high risk, really high level of injuries, and as Paul gave you some figures earlier. And their conclusion was that organisations had to do things systematically to evaluate, to understand their risk profile, and do it proactively. And it wasn't a light bulb moment for me, because that's basically what I've been repeating for a number of decades. And but it was the conclusion of that particular research. And I guess it's not being able to see any faces. I don't know if it's a really obvious thing for everybody in the room, but it is. When I reflect on it, it is very common, if not very consistently missed in any organisational, in any approach in an organisation. As much as we know the theory, I haven't come across many organisations that actually genuinely practice a systematic approach. And that's to do, and that's around actually understanding what your risk profile is. Actually going around the whole business, looking at all the different operations and all the different processes and all the different tasks, and accounting for all the activities that you do. And it is difficult because obviously that does require a bit of knowledge, time, money, resource, collaboration with management, collaboration with other personnel, and a genuine commitment to be proactive. Otherwise, you know, like I've said, you know, it tends to be reactive. You're dealing with issues as they come. So whether that's, and there's things that you can do to establish that, and you can describe it in a system, in a process, and you can use checklists and discomfort surveys that help map out the key hotspots. But it is about looking at the whole process and your whole organisation. And in a manufacturing setting, it may well be mapping out from where the materials come in from the gate to all the different plants and operations throughout the process, as well as at the end to when your products and goods leave the gate. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about is that as a result of going out deliberately analysing and identifying what your hazardous manual tasks are, is that you collate it and keep it in a hazardous manual task register. Now that might sound a bit, I don't know, odd, but it's no different to a plant register or a chemical register. Basically, a plant register demonstrates what you know you have on your site. And I guess it's quite easy to establish a plant register. You walk around, if necessary, every square inch of your premises, and you spot something physical and obvious, and you say, that's a piece of plant, we'll record it and we'll take that into account. Some of you might say, although you won't say now, you're too quiet, that it's not that easy. Some cases I've noticed, some people don't include plant, or some include it and some have different ideas of what plant is. The answer to that, I generally say, to overcome that, is define what you consider as plant. If necessary, provide examples, guidelines, and parameters of what to include as plant. So manual handling or hazardous manual tasks is no different. Some people, going back a bit, examples might be to definitely include attachments to forklifts, whether they're different bins or different times. A definition might be something around if it's powered by an energy source, meaning to exclude handheld tools. So if you apply the same principle to hazardous manual tasks, Paul and Heidi has already gone through what are the risk characteristics of a hazardous manual task, then you are more able to objectively and readily demonstrate that you are proactive and you are managing it in a planned, structured way. Now, the addition to this, which has been mentioned, is whilst the code talks about these risk characteristics, I do, like Paul and Heidi, want to emphasise that things might not seem that risky or high risk, like sedentary tasks in working at your computer workstation. There's copious amounts of research and published data that shows sitting on your bum all day, like we've done this afternoon, is really unhealthy for you. So bear that in mind, that's a risk factor as well. And also, if you handle any living thing, people or animals, then that in itself should be considered a risk factor, and you should consider that activity or task a hazardous task. And there are psychosocial issues that do influence the rate of injuries when you perform certain tasks and activities or in certain productions and operations. And they should also be accounted for and looked out and considered when you identify and classify what a hazardous manual task is. Now, let me put my occupational therapy hat on and allied health hat on. Having said that, I do believe we are complex creatures. I believe the human body and mind does need a degree of strenuous activity to stay healthy. I don't know about you, but after 40, everything you do that you haven't done for a while feels really sore. And if you don't exercise and you force yourself to exercise, regularly 2 or 3 times a week, then you do lose muscle tone. And exercise does promote and develop and maintain muscle tone and help with your posture. But obviously, exercise or recreational activities does include a degree of strenuous work. It does include repetition. It does include forceful movement. But as Paul said, dynamic work isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's obviously me and my gym partner in some other dimension. So what do we do? It seems like a contradiction from what we spoke about earlier in terms of the risk factors. Well, that's where risk assessments come into the picture. I'm not going to repeat and explain all the tools and details about the various risk assessments. I think Heidi's done a great job. There's a couple of things that I would point out, though, about the value of risk assessments. The risk assessment, as Heidi has said, gives you certain measures and certain ways of analysing and structuring essentially an argument for change. But it doesn't replace your thinking. That's why it's called an assessment. So the person, or ideally group of people involved in the assessment, will do the thinking and will have somebody, if not within the group, outside of the group, that will approve what you determine out of the risk assessment. And the risk assessment tool gives you some, analytical basis, objective basis to provide that recommendation, but it doesn't replace how you actually think about it and what you determine as safe to continue to do. So if it does involve some degree of repetition or forceful movement, but you select a range of good risk controls, then you may very well decide to continue that activity. The other thing I would point out is about a risk assessment is it should be an empowering tool. And by that I mean, I agree, if it's just a piece of paper that you tick and flick or that you fill in because you need to, and at our workplace, every time we move to another workstation, we have to do another workstation assessment. If it's a tick and flick and the people doing it don't feel empowered to recommend or suggest any changes, or don't feel comfortable in telling you what they feel in terms of discomfort, then I agree, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of paper. And I think that's where the cynicism and the critics come from when they talk about, in terms of a documented approach and so forth. They miss the point that it's not the actual tool that does the job, it's the people involved that does the job in terms of assessment that makes it useful. Does that make sense? So again, the tool that you select, a apart from those two principles, I think you also need to consider how sensitive the risk ratings are, because as if we have time, I'll give you a personal example. That will allow you to select different options that might seem at face value very similar, but if your risk ratings are sensitive, it can allow you to distinguish which option is better. Now, I am thinking that I am preaching to the converted, but the area of hierarchy of control and consultation fall left for me to talk about. The thing from an evaluator point of view is that I don't consider any piece of document a full risk assessment unless I can clearly see that the hierarchy of control has been considered and applied. That's probably one out of a range of reasons why I don't consider job dictionaries risk assessments. Consultation, I know it might be bandied about often, particularly in our circles of work life. We call it participation in ergonomics, but it's essentially consultation. And really, again, if I can't see the operators being involved in the risk assessment, I don't deem it as a credible, suitable, complete risk assessment. I still come across risk assessments that have one person that completes it and they submit it as a risk assessment. So, yeah, those are critical aspects that are needed to be demonstrated in a risk assessment. And that's also applicable when you use an external person, and that's probably more common when you use an external consultant and they tell you wonderful things, but organisations are shocked that I discount that or tell them to go back and consult with their workforce too and see what other options there are available from their feedback as well. Now, going back to the system, there are different things you should consider when designing and describing what you do to manage hazardous manual tasks. Some of the next slides are around that. And this is, I guess, to make it as obvious as I can. A system doesn't necessarily have to be complicated, but you do need to understand the context and situation of what you're doing. So up to now, we've talked about the starting point is that you go out and identify a hazardous task. And then you assess and figure out solutions to address whatever the problem you've identified. Those solutions may very well involve recommending a lifting aid or mechanical device to reduce that risk. That piece of mechanical device is a piece of plant, and any decent, good safety system will require a plant risk assessment. Those two documents are not either or incompatible. They just need to be understood and considered together. So the next document, the plant risk assessment, will aim to ensure that no additional hazards and risks are introduced, so that it doesn't dilute the solution to the problem that you were aiming to achieve in the first place. And being a plant risk assessment, it actually looks at different risks that you need to ensure that you can control, because there's nothing, I sound like I'm contradicting myself, but there's nothing wrong with introducing risks as long as you control them. So if it is powered by an electrical source, there are electrical standards that you need to check that that piece of plant and equipment is compliant to. And those two documents are important to have in your system to establish that you are being genuine about your safe processes. At the risk of getting more complicated, a aside from the hazardous task situation, if you purchase a large item of plant on its own, that might be the starting point. So if you purchase a new forklift, for example, I heard another example earlier, then that will require a plant risk assessment. And the plant risk assessment, as I mentioned, does have specific plant risk prompts like shearing, entanglement, entrapment type things to look out for. It also has ergonomics or manual handling, and remember what I said about the definition of ergonomics. But I guess if there are issues that are addressed when that prompt is answered, then I wouldn't necessarily expect another full-blown hazardous task risk assessment. That isn't always the case. Again, in more complex organisations with different types of plant and equipment, there may be a requirement to still do a full hazardous task risk assessment if the issue is rated at a certain level. So there's different documents that are at play and should work together when being developed, when being maintained, and also reviewed. Does that sort of make sense? Have I lost anybody? Yes? No?
Makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, it does get complicated, and like I said, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's about looking at your organisation, all your different processes. So if you have a manual handling procedure, it may have certain requirements to do things at certain times, to fill in a risk assessment or to consult or to do X, Y, and Z. If you don't consider all the other processes in your business that relate to it, that's when a system gets complicated and bureaucratic and gets a siloed sort of approach. But if you look at the broader scope of the business and what other procedures there are, then you can make connections and you can build in reminders of when things need to be considered and done. An easy example is training. Often I find the results of risk assessments magically comes from extreme to low because the risk controller is training and nothing much more in between. And then when I go to the training program and the training people, I go, oh, have you considered the results of these risk assessments, and it says this, this and that? Yeah, no. So that's needed to link in and connect to each other. And if you don't have that, then again, it is just another piece of paper that you tick the box and it doesn't mean anything. If it isn't linked together and it isn't followed through, you might not have the advantage of somebody like me actually saying that it doesn't connect and there's nothing happening, but you can actually figure it out yourself. The second to last point, formally, that I'll say is that it is critical to regularly, periodically review your risk controls. All the effort, whether it's internal or external expertise and time and money that you've done to assess the issue and put in a control, will eventually mean nothing if you don't review it and maintain it consistently and periodically over time. Now, this is another question to you. Can anybody tell me why the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, doesn't apply in this situation?
Because it could be the wrong process.
Yeah. What do we know about risk assessments? Susan?
Specific to task, specific thing.
Yeah, it should be specific to the task.
They've done it at a specific point in time.
Beautiful, getting close, very close. Well, it's one of the issues. It's done at a particular point in time by a particular person or group of people that using a particular tool and having, like Heidi said, a particular view of the world, a particular risk tolerance. My risk tolerance is definitely different to your risk tolerance. And if you always, or by default, only review that risk assessment because something has changed or there's been an injury, then you're not doing it in the view of continuous improvement, and you're not going to get the best results over time. Because guaranteed, at one point in time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, that technology will change. Things will become cheaper and more accessible, and again, I don't want to go into legislation, but things that might have been considered unreasonable may well be perfectly reasonably practical to apply later in time. Does that make sense?
Yep.
The last formal thing I'll say is that no matter how simple the tool is, I really encourage you to train all those involved in using the tool. Not just using the tool, but if you have a management responsibility, convincing them that the tool is useful, that the organisation agrees to the risk method or the analysis method, and provided that there's legitimate, reasonable, good reasoning behind it, more times than not, they will agree with the recommendation. If you don't explain to them, whether it's in a formal training or not, that it's part of the process and it's part of the way we do business, then, and leave it up to them to just fill in the form, yes, it will become a piece of paper that doesn't mean anything because nobody cares and nobody's gone to the effort of actually explaining it to them how important and powerful that tool can be. So, in the interest, how are we going for time?
Right on time.
Good?
Yep.
In the interest of the theme for Safe Work Month, I do have a conversation starter, not that I've been very successful, but it's based on my personal example, so I can continue doing the talking. And I guess as a bit of a clause, because it's a personal example, it's not work related, and a lot of the things I've said can be sort of put aside for the time being, and there weren't any animals hurt or named in the process. So a while ago now, but I used this example. I promised my kids to build them a treehouse, and for those of you who know me personally, I'm not much of a handyman, and it took, well, probably over a year, to be honest, in my spare time, which I don't have much. And my neighbour at the time, knew what I was doing. He was, he is a better carpenter than me. Finished his treehouse before I did, and my kids kept on complaining when were they going to get their treehouse. At one point, I was using a Bosch drill, and it's a power cord, and I thought it had ample power. I don't know, I didn't know there were different drills. And I was drilling a bolt and a screw into hardwood, and smoke came out of the drill, and it sparked, and I go, whoa, what's happening? And I couldn't figure out, why this huge, powerful drill that cost a fortune couldn't do the job. So my neighbour, who, again, is a better tradesperson than I am, helped me out on a few occasions, and he brought along this tiny handheld battery-operated drill. It's called an impact drill. It's a short, stubby little drill. Does anybody know what an impact drill is?
No.
2, 3, 4. Well, I'm glad I wasn't the only one that didn't know what an impact drill was. And it literally drilled all the screws and bolts like it was Swiss cheese. So I guess talking to my other boss, providing the rationale, albeit not documented, that I needed an impact drill because that would reduce the stress and strain and working at heights and electrical issues that I was struggling with, and would help me complete the job safer and quicker. So I did, and I got myself a new impact drill, and that's the importance of assessing it, knowing what's available through internal, external expertise within the assessment group, and getting the best outcome as a result of the assessment. So, in summary, have a system in place. Please design it the way you think will work, that makes sense to you, that you know anybody can read in your organisation and would understand and should be able to follow. Be proactive, and essentially in designing a system, say what you do what you say, and prove it. Any further questions? Ask Paul and Heidi.
Thanks very much, Heidi. Excellent. Right, I'll invite questions now of the three panellists. What we might do is, I think not Jess, my eyes are failing me, Jasmine has a microphone here. So yeah, any questions? Do we have another microphone yet for people speaking down here? Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, we have a question down here.
Hi, just with regards to risk assessments and identifying hazardous tasks, if there's something that's obviously hazardous, you need to go through that risk assessment process, or can you just go straight into writing up procedure with the controls? And then maybe reassess later.
Do you want me to speak as an inspector or an evaluator, or?
Well, actually as an inspector, because we actually get audited externally, so I don't want to do things and then I should have done it a different way.
I'm no longer employed as an inspector, so I'll let somebody else answer. So I don't want to.
Okay, I just better explain. I'm part of the advisory team, so I'm not an inspector, but I do know sort of the flavour of what to look at. And I was just about to dive for the code of practice there, which I've got on my bag, but I can tell you, I think on page 2 of the code, it actually says that you must risk assess all hazardous manual tasks unless the risk of those tasks is already well known and controlled. So, for example, if I dropped a pen on the floor here, for example, I don't have to do a risk assessment to pick up that pen, even though that's actually potentially a hazardous manual task, because I could do my back in a bad posture, picking up that pen and getting up too fast with the leverage forces and the acceleration. But the code actually it gives a few examples like that, where very simple things like that, where you know the answer already, you don't have to risk assess. So it is still very subjective.
So if I can add to that.
I was going to say, Paul, we're self-insured, and we know if return to work SA come to visit us, they want to see a risk assessment. So we would do the risk assessment regardless. We would do it so we go through that process of looking at all our hazardous activities. We identify them as in a hazard register, and then we would look at each activity and we would do a task risk assessment, and then out of that task risk assessment would fall any hazardous manual handling task risk assessment. So that's the way we do it. So as self-insured, we're expected to have them documentation and to have gone through that process.
Yeah, I don't tend to agree with exactly what you're doing. It's only the very simple tasks that you shouldn't have to. For example,
It's our hazardous tasks.
I just realised I can see you all now if I do this. I have heard of people actually hurting their backs quite badly doing up their shoelaces.
No,
just
no,
in a
no,
bad
no.
posture.
We
You don't get an
identify
assessment
our
please.
hazardous activities. So you identify your hazardous activity, things that's going to kill you, things that's going to hurt you badly. You don't do every single activity that we do. You identify what are the activities that's going to hurt you.
Yep, that's exactly the right process, and
Yep.
that's exactly what the code of
Thanks,
practice
Paul.
says as well.
Thank you.
I can only reiterate and confirm that, and
Thank
my understanding and reading of the code, using the code's examples, is it's purely only very simple issues that obviously can be addressed at that time. And it does say where it's known industry practice and guidelines. So if there isn't something that is in the form of a risk assessment, I would challenge the business to prove how do they know it's an industry guideline? How do they know that it's accepted across many different businesses? And if they can present the evidence and the information and how they did that, that's probably a risk assessment in itself.
Okay, thank you.
Now, one thing I've seen very few risk assessments for is for people using just a standard computer keyboard or a computer mouse. And we know that's actually quite a hazardous task. But I don't know about you, Sally, but in very few workplaces actually have a risk assessment for typing. Have you come across any of those?
I can agree, there's actually we don't have all the control and the influence, and we don't have, we can't prescribe too many things. Those are the areas I encourage organisations to take into account. What I went through are more describing principles and practices that we sort of rely on and can reasonably enforce in a sort of structured way. But in terms of prescribing exact methods and exact processes, that's sort of outside of what we can do. But I certainly would, if an issue arose, report it as an observation. There's these issues that have been fed back through consultation, and it might be worth looking more in detail in terms of whatever the keyboard issue is that Paul's referring to.
Just out of interest, did you realise about 50 years ago, if any of you guys can remember the old manual typewriters, virtually no one got RSI from the old manual typewriters. And I just saw someone do the movement there. Yeah, that's right. So simply the act of
They don't just do that all the time.
you did right. So after every line, which could be 20 seconds, you put your arm up and slide, and that's dynamic work, and it's enough to create a micro pause. So that's the sort of thing that maybe we should be picking up in risk assessments. Now, if enough people pick it up, we should be putting pressure on keyboard manufacturers to maybe build in a dummy lever that people have to reach for. If you don't hit it, nothing works. Another reason was actually the lack of back pressure coming off the keys with modern keyboards. The old typewriters, if anyone's old enough to remember those, every time you typed one of those keys, the key would actually flick up, which took all the pressure off your wrist and off the back of your fingers. And again, now we've got keyboards with no back pressure.
And caught your finger between the keys.
So there are some very significant hazards there with modern keyboards, and especially tablets with no back pressure at all that we're not addressing at the moment.
Yeah.
And our legislation says very clearly that designers, manufacturers, products, they have to take the risk of hazardous the risk of NSDs into account in that design process. And there's so many cases where it's sort of not been done at the moment.
Okay, have we got any more questions from the audience?
Comment?
Comments?
Very interesting, Paul, some of the stuff that you did with the demonstration that you did. Because we do task risk assessment. They can hear me, I think. Does everybody hear me? Yes, now? So the stuff that you demonstrated, because we do hundreds of task risk assessments. We have been doing for many, many years. And some of the stuff that you talked about, we've never, ever or thought about for this sort of thing. So we'll start putting some of that stuff into when we're doing task risk assessments. Yeah, it's
Okay,
interesting.
thanks for that.
Yeah,
There's,
yeah.
there's one thing I forgot to say during the talk, which is very important. I'll just say it now if you don't mind. And it's to do with when I was talking about deceleration. One thing I've noticed over the years is more people get injured in the process of putting a load down than they do actually picking a load up. Have you noticed that?
Yep.
And a couple of reasons, but the first reason is people take less care when they're putting a load down because they believe, hey, it's downwards, less force, less risk. But it's actually to do with the deceleration effect. For example, if I'm putting a box down like this, it's almost down, I notice an obstruction, and suddenly I put the brakes on, and I've got that potentially 6-to-1 ratio of the weight. So my 10-kilo box is suddenly 60 kilos when I put the brakes on. So it's a combination of bad posture, because people aren't planning the lift, which they do when they're actually picking something up. The combination of that and and the deceleration effect. So just really keep that one in mind when you're doing your task analysis. People are more at risk putting the load down. And unfortunately, I've seen a number of injuries from that.
Just with regard to that particular task, deceleration and acceleration, do you have anything that you, like posters that you can put up for the workplace? Because as far as I'm concerned, I have no idea either, so I agree with you totally.
Yeah.
It's a new concept entirely. So I think it's about education, and sometimes you just need those visual aids as well, so it's nice to just have things where they're quite visible as a reminder. Do you have anything like that already?
We've got nothing at the moment to do with acceleration, but we can certainly put something together. We've got a fantastic communications team at Safe Work to Say.
I think that would be useful because it seems to me that it's kind of a new idea, I guess, or a new way of looking at it.
No, thanks very much. We'll do our best to get something for you.
You're out there trailblazing, Paul. That's what's happening.
The trouble is all our competitor countries are way ahead of us.
Oh,
So we've got to catch up.
we'll move faster then.
Gavin.
This is just a question out of left field a little bit. I heard an interesting continuous improvement KPI the other day, which was very simple but thought-provoking for me. I'm just interested in the comment. That KPI being the number of ideas from workers implemented as a KPI. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a big topic.
Yeah.
I talk about KPIs all the time. It is about continuous improvement, and what I often reflect is that the reason, in part, that people hang on to KPIs like lost time incidents and rates and so forth is that that's the only structured, mechanism that a business will invest in and consistently make people report into so that they can physically get a result out of. That's why people refer to it easily and have data reports, reams and reams of paper around, the different body locations and the like. And, being in any registered business, whether you're self-insured or not, that's certainly a good thing in terms of understanding your risk, your injury profile. But it is a reactive measure. So, leading to the answer to your question, I tend to think it's in the right direction, but it's still a reactive measure. It's still relying on your workforce to tell you things. And the obligation, first and foremost, like it or not, is on the employer to understand what their risk profile is and to genuinely go about assessing it and improving it over time. I don't expect perfection, but we do expect a structured approach with a few internal, external expertise to actually drive and improve a system over time. And certainly that KPI can be one out of hopefully many positive KPIs that adds to the commitment and push to improve things.
I was just going to add that I think that within the context of a participative ergonomics program within your workplace would sit quite well. So if you're having focus groups with your workers, you're asking for their input on the improvements that they'd like to have, then that's the participative ergonomics program is what you're driving for your initiative, and you're gathering those KPIs within the context of that program, and that would sit quite well.
Good, if I can do a little plug, that I probably not much of a plug. The workshop that I did last week with the ergonomist people that published their paper, developed their own tool to measure, to look at psychosocial risk factors. And although I wasn't convinced that it would replace an existing system to do the hazardous task risk assessments, if you had measures, if you had that program, it was actually really cheap. It was like $495 for a one-day workshop, and you would have access to that program. That would give you that mechanism to measure psychosocial risk factors, obviously within the parameters of that tool. And that could be considered another positive KPI or suite of measures that are positive, that is deliberately being done by the organisation and deliberately, looking at the whole system and all the workforce.
I was just going to add one more comment of instead of looking at your existing work practices as well, do look at your risk assessments from a viewpoint of any planned new plant, any planned new design or facility, any planned new workstation setup that is going to be getting implemented within your workplace. Do a risk assessment on those. So look at your plans, look at the equipment that they're looking to purchase, implement, and try to work out what your hazardous manual tasks are before they get implemented within your workplace, because the number of people that we get called out to provide assistance to that we've already made the change, they've already implemented a new piece of machinery or equipment or whatever it might be, and then you've spent thousands of dollars on that, and a better decision could have been made beforehand without having that consultation. It's, to me, it's kind of like wasted money. So, we'll quite often look at engineering's drawings of, a new piece of equipment or machinery that could be in place and be asked to make comment on whether there are any other hazardous manual elements of that plan moving forward. So there is an ability, I would encourage you, make sure as safety professionals that you are empowered to know what the plans are within your organisation to be making any extensions, plans, new plants, etc. And make sure you're doing risk assessments of those before they get implemented. Identify where those hazards are so that you can actually make those changes and you won't get the old, oh well, somebody just went and purchased that, now we're stuck with it. So think forward down that, hazardous manual task identification isn't about what is physically in place now. You can also do it projecting into the future as well.
Can I just make one more comment? Something I've noticed in many workplaces is the culture of near-miss reporting for hazardous manual tasks is very weak compared to some other types of hazards. So I just really encourage you to really try and beef up the near-miss reporting. And what made me think of that was the question about KPIs. There's a big KPI we used to use back in New Zealand was looking at the ratio of near misses to actual lost time injuries. For example, if we had a contractor that had maybe 2 lost time injuries and 50 near misses reported per year, we'd probably look a lot more favourably on them than a contractor with 5 injuries and only 10 near misses reported. The one with a greater near miss reporting we see is having a much better culture. And I've never really seen an index used here since I've been over here in Aussie, but it was a very common one back in New Zealand. So I might really encourage you to have a closer look at that.
I should clarify if I sounded too cynical about hazard reports and sort of those KPIs. They're very important from what Paul said exactly. And I guess part of making it work is ensuring that it isn't just a KPI for the sake of it. So there's actually, again, an investigation that goes with it that is more than a tick and flick exercise, because as much as it's a good KPI that's better than an injury KPI, if you don't invest the time to actually analyse those hazards that's been reported, or the near misses, then you're just collecting something for the sake of it and beating yourself on the chest to say you're really good. All too often I see really good in-depth investigations only applied for really serious injuries, which of course they need to be, but totally drop off for anything else.
All right, well done. Thank you very much. Just like you to join with me in thanking our presenters today, and we have a